Wyoming Territory, October 1879. The wind cut low through the pines like a warning, but the smoke caught his nose first thin and bitter, like a fire burned too long on too little. Dalton Price pulled his horse to a stop, eyes narrowing through the dusk. He had been riding north since dawn, chasing nothing but silence. What he found instead was a fading trail of wood smoke curling into the sky above a cluster of rocks near the creek. He dismounted without a word, boots crunching over brittle leaves. As he stepped around the bend, the sight made his stomach twist. She was barely upright, arms wrapped tight around herself, a blanket draped over her shoulders like it had lost the will to warm her. The fire in front of her had shrunk to red coals, throwing soft shadows across her face, pale, drawn, lips cracked. Her eyes fluttered open as he approached, wide and red-rimmed. "Do not come closer," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I got a knife." Dalton did not stop walking. "If you had any strength left, you would have used it before I got this close," he said, kneeling by the fire. His voice was gentle but steady. "Let me help." She stared at him, chest rising and falling fast, then her shoulders dropped. "I ain't got nothing you want," she murmured, eyes closing again. Dalton pulled the saddlebag off his horse and reached for the jerky and canteen inside. He poured water into a tin cup and held it out. "Drink this first," he said. "Then we figure the rest." She looked at the cup like it might vanish. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it. She drank it all. He stoked the fire next, adding dry kindling and bark until it caught. The light grew warmer, brighter. She flinched at the sudden heat, but did not move away. "What is your name?" he asked quietly. "Alma," she said, voice hoarse. "Alma Carr," he nodded once. "Dalton Price." She looked up at him then, really looked. "You a rancher?" "Used to be." He did not say more, and she did not ask. She leaned closer to the fire, hands outstretched. Her fingers were scraped raw. He handed her a piece of jerky. "Eat slow." She nodded and obeyed. She chewed it like it hurt. Dalton waited until she finished before he asked, "How long since you ate?" 2 days, she said after a pause. "Maybe 3, I lost count." His jaw tensed. "Why are you out here, Alma?" She looked away. "I did not mean to be." That was all she said. Dalton did not push. He stood and started setting up his own bedroll near hers, not too close, just within reach of the firelight. She watched him with tired eyes. "You do not have to stay," she murmured. "I know," he said simply. They did not speak again that night. In the weak morning light, Alma looked like a ghost of herself. She had dark hair twisted into a loose braid, but it was matted with dust. Her dress was torn at the hem, caked with dried mud. Her shoes had holes. She struggled to stand, and Dalton caught her elbow before she could fall. "Easy," he said. "You are still weak." "I need to move," she said, jaw set. "I cannot stay here." "I am not leaving you behind," he replied. "You ride with me." Alma looked at him, really looked this time, and something inside her cracked. Her chin trembled. "I do not want your pity." "This is not pity," Dalton said. He met her gaze. "This is a man who found a woman freezing beside a dying fire and decided he would not ride away." Her eyes filled, but she blinked fast and turned her face. They rode slow that day. Dalton kept her in front of him on his gelding, arms steady around her waist. She tensed at first, but as the hours passed, her body leaned into his. She was warm again, breathing steady. Alive. They reached a small abandoned cabin by dusk. Dalton had found it years back while driving cattle. It was nothing but wood and nails, but it had a roof and a stone hearth. He helped her off the horse and guided her inside. She moved stiffly, but her steps were stronger than the day before. Inside, he made a fire and heated beans over the flame. Alma sat near the hearth, arms wrapped around her knees. "You said you did not mean to be out there," Dalton said quietly. "If you want to tell me more, I am listening." Alma was silent for a long time. Then she said, "I was traveling with my cousin's family, headed west. We were going to join her husband in Montana. He paid for the wagon, and she let me come along after my parents passed." Dalton sat down across from her, waiting. "We got robbed 2 weeks ago," she whispered. 3 men. They took the oxen, the wagon, everything. Her husband's letters said to follow the North Trail, so she insisted we keep walking. But the kids," her voice broke. "Hattie and Henry, her babies." Dalton's chest went cold. "She left me behind to find help, said she would carry both children. I waited." I waited 3 nights. Alma buried her face in her hands. I think they are gone. Dalton's throat ached. He moved closer, slow and quiet, and placed a hand on her arm. You do not have to face that alone, he said. She looked up. Her face was streaked with tears. I am so tired, she whispered. I know, he said, but you are not alone anymore. The next days were quiet. Alma grew stronger. She helped gather kindling, stirred the beans, even laughed once when Dalton nearly fell off the porch trying to scare off a raccoon. He did not talk about his past, but she noticed the way he stared at the fire some nights, eyes lost in things he did not say. Then one morning, as they sat on the porch with coffee, Alma said, "Why were you riding alone, Dalton?" He did not look away. "I lost my brother 2 winters ago. We ran the ranch together. After he passed, I could not stay." She nodded slowly. "I know what it is to lose everything," she said. Their eyes met. "I do not want to be alone anymore," she said softly. Dalton reached out and touched her hand. Her fingers curled around his. "You are not," he said, and she believed him. The first snow came quiet, as if the sky had forgotten how to shout. It dusted the roof of the cabin and softened the world beyond the porch into a hush that neither Dalton nor Alma disturbed. She stood beside him, wrapped in a wool coat he'd pulled from his pack the day before. It hung too heavy on her shoulders, but she didn't complain. Dalton watched her eyes scan the tree line, not with fear now, but a kind of alertness he hadn't seen when he first found her. She didn't flinch when the wind stirred the pines. She didn't ask for more than she needed. "You ever been through a Wyoming winter?" he asked, breaking the silence. "No," she said. "Closest I got was a fall storm in Nebraska, froze through my boots. Thought I'd never feel my toes again." Dalton nodded toward the woodpile he'd been building up. "We'll need more than what's stacked. I can show you how to split the rounds if your arms are ready for it." "I'll manage," she said. "I want to pull my weight." He didn't doubt it. That first night she could barely hold a cup steady. Now her steps were sure on the porch, and her voice didn't catch when she spoke. She still startled at sudden noises, but she no longer looked like she was ready to vanish into the trees. They spent the morning working in silence. Dalton chopped. Alma carried, her hands blistered, but she didn't stop until he did. He watched her from the corner of his eye as she paused to stretch her back. Her braid had come loose, strands of dark hair falling across her cheek. She didn't brush them away. "You move like someone who's been working since she could walk," he said, setting the axe down. Alma leaned against the beam of the porch. "My father ran a dry goods store in Kansas. Nothing fancy, but he kept it open 6 days a week, and I stocked shelves between school and supper. After he passed, I scrubbed floors for the church to keep us fed. My mother taught me to hem trousers before I could read." Dalton sat on the porch step, wiping his brow with a sleeve. "That explains the calluses." She looked at her palms. "They're not much to look at. They say more than most folks' words ever will." Alma lowered herself beside him. She didn't speak for a while, and neither did he. The air had shifted cooler, but not cold. The fire inside the cabin crackled steady, and the scent of beans from the midday pot drifted through the open door. "I used to think I'd marry a store clerk," she said eventually. "Someone who came home at 5 and brought hard candy in his pocket." Dalton tilted his head. "You disappointed it didn't turn out that way?" She gave a slow shake of her head. "No, I don't think I ever truly wanted it. I just thought I was supposed to." He studied her profile. "What about now? I'm not sure what I want," she admitted, "but I know what I don't." Dalton waited. She turned toward him then, eyes steady. "I don't want to be spoken over or treated like something that needs fixing." "You're not," he said without hesitation. "Not to me." Alma's gaze dropped to her hands. "The last man I trusted told me I was too much trouble to keep around." Dalton leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "He was a fool. He was my cousin's husband." Her voice didn't waver. "He said he'd write for me once he got settled. He never did. Left me behind like a broken chair." Dalton's fists tightened against his thighs, but he kept his voice level. "You deserve better than that." Alma looked up then, something clear and searching in her eyes. "Do you believe people can start over?" "I think sometimes they have to." They sat there as the sky moved over them, the light shifting from silver to gold without either of them noticing. When Alma stood, she didn't wobble. She reached for the bucket and stepped off the porch. "I'll fetch water," she said. "You keep the fire going." Dalton watched her walk toward the creek, a woman who had nearly died in the cold now carrying her own weight toward the next hour, the next meal, whatever came next. Inside the cabin, he stirred the beans and laid out the bread he'd baked that morning. Alma returned with the bucket, cheeks flushed from the wind, eyes bright. They ate without speaking, but not in silence. The warmth between them had grown somehow, not loud, just present. She passed him the last piece of bread without asking. He poured her the last of the coffee without a word. That night, Alma didn't sleep with her back to the wall. She lay on her side, facing the fire, and when Dalton banked the flames and settled across from her, she opened her eyes just enough to meet his. "Thank you," she said softly. He didn't ask what for. He just reached toward her, and this time she didn't pull away. Her fingers found his and she held on. The mornings settled into a rhythm, though no one named it. Dalton would rise first, tend to the horses, and check the traps he'd set near the tree line. Alma would sweep ash from the hearth and boil water for coffee. They didn't speak much in those early hours, not out of distance, but because nothing needed explaining. By the third week, Alma's laughter had returned, quiet and rare, but real. She'd taken to sketching bits of the cabin in a small ledger Dalton found in the old desk by the window. Mostly corners of beams, the iron stove, once the edge of Dalton's boot resting by the fire. She didn't show him what she drew, just kept the book tucked beneath her cot, pages turned down at the edges. One afternoon, after the snow held off a little longer than expected, they walked east through the cottonwoods. Alma carried a tin pail, collecting rosehips where they still clung red and withered along the brambles. Dalton carried his rifle, though he hadn't fired it in days. She crouched near a patch of dried sage and plucked a sprig free. "My mother boiled this with honey when we were sick," she said. "Tastes like dirt and sorrow, but it cleared the lungs." Dalton scanned the horizon, the light slanting low through the branches. "You still get sick easy?" "Not anymore," she said. "I think I used up all my frailty that first week." He nodded once. "You're steady now." She stood, brushing her hands on her skirt. "I'm trying to be." They crossed a narrow stream where the ice had started to form along the edges. Alma paused and looked down at the water. "You ever think about leaving Wyoming?" Dalton stepped beside her. "Thought about Colorado for a while, then Idaho, but the land here holds quiet." She tilted her head, considering that. "Quiet's not the same as peace." "No," he said. "But it's close kin." They made it back to the cabin before the wind turned sharp. Dalton hung his coat by the door and checked the traps he'd carried in 2 rabbits, both good size. Alma set to skinning them without being asked. Dalton watched her hands work over the fur. "You done that before?" "Once," she said. "The neighbor boy taught me. He said a girl ought to know how to fend." He was right. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "He asked to marry me the next year. I laughed at him." "Why?" He never once looked me in the eye when he spoke. "Only ever stared at my hands." Dalton sat at the edge of the table. "And mine. You look me in the eye, even when you don't like what you see." "I haven't disliked anything yet." She wiped her palms on a cloth and stood facing him. "You've been kind without asking anything back." He didn't move. "You think I should have asked?" "No," she said. "That's why I stayed." The silence between them stretched, but it held gentle. Dalton's voice dropped. "If I asked now, would you run?" Her eyes didn't waver. "Depends what you're asking." He rose slow. "I want to build something here, something real, but not alone." Alma's breath caught, but she didn't look away. "You mean with me?" "I do." She stepped closer, closing the space between them. "Then ask." Dalton took her hand, careful, reverent. "Will you stay with me, not just until the thaw, but after, through planting and drought and whatever else comes?" Her fingers tightened around his. "Yes," she said, "I'll stay." They didn't kiss, not then. They stood in the middle of the cabin, hands joined, as the wind pressed against the walls and the fire flickered warm behind them. The snow returned that night, quiet again, and neither of them felt the cold. The wind had changed. It carried the scent of juniper and something sharp beneath it, metal, maybe. Dalton paused mid-stride with the bridle slung over his shoulder and listened. The sky was low, thick with cloud, but no snow fell yet. He turned toward the ridge behind the cabin where the land sloped down into a narrow ravine and narrowed his eyes. Alma stepped out from the lean-to, arms wrapped tight around herself. Her braid had come undone, hair tucked beneath the scarf she wore against the cold. "You hear it too?" she asked. Dalton nodded once. "Riders, 2, maybe 3, not close yet, could be trappers or not." She didn't answer, just turned back toward the boiling pot of soapstone she'd been watching over. A week ago, Dalton had found the lye barrel behind the cabin half full and cracked through. They'd spent half a morning chipping it clean, and she'd insisted on finishing the work herself. Dalton tied off the bridle on the porch rail and stepped inside. He unlatched the rifle from the hooks above the door and checked the chamber. It wasn't the first time he'd had to ready for strangers, but it was the first time it mattered. When he stepped back out, Alma was already gathering the soap molds into a basket and moving them beneath the porch eaves. "You know them?" she asked without turning. "Not yet. They know you," doubtful, "but I've crossed too many trails to be sure." They didn't speak again until the first hoofbeats cracked the silence proper. The riders came down the far slope slow, as if they weren't sure what they were looking for. They were lean men, both on sorrels, both wearing coats nearly worn through at the elbows. Dust clung to their boots like they'd been traveling for days. Dalton stepped forward. "This is private land," he called, voice low but firm. The older of the two leaned on his saddle horn. "Didn't mean to trespass, just saw smoke, figured there might be coffee." "There's water at the creek," Dalton replied. "Fire's ours." The second rider looked past him, eyes catching on Alma's shape in the doorway. She didn't flinch, didn't retreat. She stood there with the basket in her arms and her chin level. "We don't want trouble," the first man said. "But we're headed north and short on food." Dalton didn't lower the rifle. "There's snares set an hour west of here. If you're honest men, you'll head that way." The riders hesitated, then turned without a word. The tension didn't drain from Dalton's shoulders until the hoofbeats faded into the trees and didn't return. Alma set the basket down and brushed her hands on her skirt. "You think they were looking for me?" Dalton didn't answer right away. He watched the horizon, then turned to her. "I don't think they came for anything good." "You didn't even blink," she said, voice quiet. "Most men would have waited to see what they wanted. I've seen what waiting costs." Her eyes searched his face. "You've been on the wrong side of it, once," he said. "Not again." She nodded slowly. "I'm not afraid anymore." He stepped closer. "You sure?" "I was afraid every day since Kansas, but I'm still standing. That has to count for something." Dalton reached out and brushed her hair back behind her ear. The motion was gentle, but his hand lingered and she didn't move away. "That counts for everything," he said. Later that night, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters. Alma sat cross-legged on the floor with Dalton's old saddle in front of her, stitching new thread through a torn seam. She worked in silence, her hands steady. Dalton sat across from her, shaping bullets at the hearth. "I want to build a garden," she said suddenly. Dalton looked up. "This spring, I figure we can dig out near the south wall. It gets the most sun. Beans, maybe squash, something that keeps." He set the bullet mold down. "You want to stay that long?" Alma looked at him, head tilted. "I already said I would. You don't have to prove anything." Her voice was firm. "I'm not proving, I'm planning." Dalton's mouth pulled into something close to a smile. "Then I'll cut the fence line wider. Make room for your rose." She reached for the saddle soap, dipping a cloth into the tin. "You ever think you'd end up here with someone?" He shook his head. "Didn't think I'd be anywhere. Thought I'd keep moving until the trail gave out." And now, he looked around the cabin, the patched roof, the stacked wood, the woman working leather in firelight. "Now I'm thinking the trail brought me where I was supposed to be." Alma leaned back on her heels and looked at him, really looked, and something quiet and certain passed between them. Not a promise, not yet, but the shape of one. "I think I'll make a trellis for the beans," she said. "And maybe a bench if you've got scrap wood left." Dalton nodded. "Anything you want." And she believed him. The snow melted slow that spring, reluctant and thick in the shaded corners of the pines. By April, the creek had swelled twice its width, pushing silt and stones downstream until the banks darkened with new earth. Alma stood barefoot in the mud with her hem gathered to her knees, sleeves rolled to her elbows as she pressed seeds into damp soil. Dalton worked beside her, driving the last of the fence posts with the flat of an iron mallet. Neither spoke. The quiet between them had changed. It had grown less like silence and more like presence. When the last row was planted, Alma brushed her hands on her skirt and looked over the furrowed ground. "Do you think it'll take?" Dalton leaned on the shovel. "If it doesn't, we try again. Nothing in this world grows perfect the first go." She nodded and turned toward the cabin. A hammer knocked somewhere in the rafters. Dalton had started patching the north corner that morning, the one that always sighed when the wind shifted. He'd offered to do it alone, but Alma had followed anyway, handing him nails, steadying the ladder, marking the boards with a bit of charcoal she'd kept in her apron. Inside, the cabin had changed in quiet ways. The cot was gone, the two bedrolls now joined into one frame Dalton had built from pine and fitted with wool quilts. Alma's ledger sat on the mantel now, beside the tin of matches and the carved horse Dalton's brother had once whittled. The hearth bore a new hook for the pot, one Alma had forged herself from scrap iron and sweat. At supper, she ladled stew into their bowls and sat across from him. The firelight caught the faint pink of sunburn along her nose. "Do you miss the horses?" she asked. Dalton chewed slow before answering. "Sometimes, the long rides, the hush of it. You ever think about taking them out again, just for a stretch?" "I could," he said, "if you came with me." Alma gave a soft breath through her nose. "I might, if there's a reason." Dalton looked at her then. "You ever think about marriage?" She didn't flinch. "I do, more than I used to. I've been thinking on it too." Alma set her spoon down. "You planning to ask?" "I'm waiting for the right time." She tilted her head. "What would make it right?" Dalton reached across the table, his hand rough and sure as it closed over hers. "You saying yes?" She didn't speak, just stood and came around the table. He rose to meet her, and she took his face in both hands. Her touch was warm from the fire, and her eyes didn't waver. "Yes," she said. He kissed her then, slow and certain. There was no surprise in it, only the quiet relief of something long understood and finally spoken. They married under the cottonwoods, where the ground had dried enough to hold their steps without sinking. No preacher came. Dalton read from the worn Bible he kept in the chest at the foot of the bed, the one their mother had left them. Alma wore a dress she'd stitched from old curtain linen, and Dalton had pressed his shirt with the flat of the wood stove. A pair of blackbirds called from the trees, and the wind held still, as if listening. Afterward, Alma planted a line of columbine beside the porch. She said it would be the first thing travelers saw when they came down the trail. Dalton built her a bench beside it and carved her name into the back rail. By midsummer, the beans climbed their trellies in thick green ropes, and squash blossoms opened wide each morning. The cabin stayed warm at night, even when the wind rose out of the east. Alma kept a small tin of pressed flowers on the shelf, and Dalton hung his rifle above the door, untouched. In August, Alma sat on the porch with her hand resting low on her belly. She looked out over the clearing as rabbits scattered through the tall grass. "You think it'll be a boy or a girl?" she asked. Dalton set the pail of water down and came to sit beside her. "Whichever it is, they'll grow up with 2 hands in the dirt and a roof that holds." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "And 2 people who'll never turn away." The sun dipped low, casting long light across the field. The garden rustled in the breeze, and the creek hummed in the distance. Inside, the fire smoldered low, but no one stirred to tend it. They had come through the worst of it and found something waiting on the other side, not perfect, not easy, but theirs. And they never walked alone again.